Oh my, forever that will be my favorite sound. Let me think. On this day, Galinada, happy full moon. It's not often I get to be smack dab in the middle of it with you. So, party on. Um, there's a lot going on, and it all weaves very much together. So, I don't mean to swamp with information either. There are interconnectedness with so much. The full moon in Cancer, so it's a very temperamental time. Not to be confused with just emotion, as in trusting of your emotion implicitly. We have to be able to introspect. We have to be able to take and receive information and digest it and know whether or not that fits into our truth mathematically, spiritually. It's actually quite an equation. A very simple one. Full of ease, I promise you that. The geometry of relationships is, in fact, right relationship, but not as in right or wrong. There is no left or right in time, which is not from me, from Julian James, PhD. Full moon in Cancer with Jupiter at that. A largely domineering, but also largely misunderstood and perhaps misappropriated energy. We've come to discover quite a bit about Jupiter. The amount of moons, the planet with the most moons. I believe it still has the most rings. And altogether what it consists of and what the core of it is. So in a very big way, that discovery scientifically, these discoveries and these inquisitions scientifically, are also very much happening on an inner scale. And that's not to say without your identity or what you describe as identity at this current moment you are lost. That is to say whether or not you are willing to take control of the program, whether or not you are willing to establish your own, like tread your own path rather than follow along. Because Jupiter and Uranus can very much, because it's also very much like angular, like feeding and magnifying this energy. In the same way that the moon receives its light from the sun and projects its own power, is also the ways in which Jupiter and Uranus's relationship is also very much impacting in this full moon, which has a lot to do with division in thought and in society and in, you know, a party and what have you. But more so, I think, compartmentalization, which I think is something that is awarded, although is very much more a coping mechanism than an actual cognitive skill, and one that can lead to madness and isolation rather than integration. And that is with knowledge, with great knowledge, and also with great pleasure. And so that is, I think, the step beyond the line of abstinence and integrity, or you know, following or integrity, or you know, people pleasing and such, and integrity. Also influenced is, of course, Venus and Mars' relationship with Mercury and the ways in which, yet again, this is an internalized war, much beyond a superficial level, an internalized, you know, battle, friction in any way, shape, or form. Also rising heat and what we do with it, but that's also where we make use of these water elements without just trusting them implicitly, in the same way that Jupiter does, and is, yes, a gas, but also a liquid, but also a solid, and doesn't differentiate really between the many versions of itself. And so here's a point of close to the sun and of boiling point with the Earth at perihelion, which I think also is like, if you continue to stir, it would make a viscous fluid, would make like gelatinous, like broth. No, not broth. The difference between, I suppose, broth and stock. Um, uh, funny bit. But if you leave it and you don't stir it, like sugars, like simple syrups, then you can burn it. Or if you've ever burnt water making ramen, that is also what occurs if we leave stagnant water too close to the sun. It's the life forms, the parasites, the worms that rise to the surface. So there's many ways we can deal with this. That's very intense. I hope they rise to the surface and are starved from you. But that relationship, Mercury's information, is also very much our distinction between collaboration or compartmentalization, the ways in which these things intersect, but the ways in which I also think our relationships are identified by compromise rather than collaboration. And I think we can learn a thing or two from artists that work together in unison in general. We ought not have to compromise our own principles or our own sense of self in order to fit into a box or a mold. Jupiter doesn't differentiate again. And I think that's also, collaboration with your mind and your heart, understanding the difference between your impulse and your intuition, your impulse or your actual higher thinking skills, and your ability, again, to integrate. It's very much innovated with our ideas of consciousness, and just because you are awake and breathing and blinking does not necessarily equate. In fact, there's many things we do unconsciously, and conversely, many things that we thought were entirely unconscious that we can activate, innovate ourselves into. So if there's interference, that is an opportunity to take responsibility rather than to assume outside authority and loss of control. That being said, this energy is very much in opposition to the moon, so it is, again, I think, very magnified. I think very assisting rather than contrasting, if we allow it to be. If we allow these things to, not duke it out, mince words, perhaps. If you allow these wounds to breathe, ultimately any wound requires some oxygen to feed the cells, to grow, to learn, to find its counterparts. With all of that being said, I do very much think that there's perhaps an incredible grief wave collectively because of all of this intensity and conversation magnifying our own identity of relationships with emotion and with presence in general. But also, long term, Jupiter's doing some weird stuff. And Pluto's now in an even weirder place. So I think, we grieve the time before it, we grieve the sense of identity or sense of value preceding, but that does not mean the end. That means very much a new beginning. Beyond the fear of death is new life. And it's not something that I say lightly. That is something that I think is, a very intense understanding and I think very sacred work to face and to look at, eyes wide open. Once upon a time in my life, I thought death was perhaps as exhilarating as walking around and living with your eyes closed. And I think I've come to understand that perhaps life is even more exhilarating, but as exhilarating as looking death with your eyes wide open, staring fear in the face. So with that being said, try something new. Try something out of your comfort zone, because it will continue to inform your comfort zone too. Like, it will continue to grow. Doing something else continues to grow the best parts of you, and the parts that that you love about you will flourish, because you're also watering them from other places, from other ways. It's like adding nutrients to the soil. In a large part, and that's something that can be methodically done, but logic can only take us so far, and it's something that has to be experienced in the right side of the brain, in the ways in which we receive an internalized nurturing in a great way, and it is possible to be done in many a way. Bring new life to dead dreaming. How to bring life to dead dreaming. It's an interesting time. A lot is falling away. I think a lot of people, well-meaning people, perhaps did everything that they thought they needed to do, and are finding that they still have not found this epiphany of peace and bliss that they were expecting. This idea of satisfaction that was supposed to be at the end of that rainbow, that somebody perhaps told them to follow, or that somebody we admired, some book we read told us to follow. That is very much because, we build on a feeble sense of identity, and then wonder why we don't feel fed. We chase a high and then wonder why we don't feel grounded. We chase patterns and then wonder why they repeat. We chase our tail and then wonder why it hurts or confuses us. And that is by design. That is, in fact, why these systems work. I think the Earth at perihelion is very much this boiling point rather than a new beginning. And so, perhaps the Gregorian New Year is designed to exhaust you at a time when you're so malleable, at a time when the collective is so malleable, impressionable even. And I think that's very much, again, this Venus-Mars conversation. Collaboration also has to, utilize consent and consciousness. But if we don't have consciousness to give, we are swept into an impressionable wave. Distinctly from the grief wave, I think there's separate ways to deal with that. I think there's very separate ways to deal with that. And that's an understanding the directional quality, where the root quality comes from, rather than just the symptom. Take temperature of your internal landscape, and that will assist you in how to deal with it. Very literally, very chemically, very elementally. Because I think grief is a wave. You find ways to ride and ways to embrace, and impressionability it requires the same level of self-knowing, but so much so in that you identify like the negative space. Like when they teach you how to draw in like beginners classes, they teach you, contour of things, but also to see outside of the thing that you're trying to draw, like the negative, invert a photograph, and it defines or contrasts for you. And so in a very real way, we have to do that with ourselves, so that we know where things ride up against us, and that we're able to identify whether or not that is a part of our truth, or whether or not it is a trigger to our truth, which ultimately is a Anglo-Saxon root of the word truth. is your trigness, your structure, like how foundational your belief is. And also in that, it's not one isolated component, it is many truths that coexist. It is the coherence of truths, essentially. Um, and so in that, if something rubs up against the way that you're building, is it because what you're building is impressionable, or because what you're building is so firm in itself that it sets a spatial boundary? You don't have to push back. Your spatial boundaries will say enough. Much like a building well built or a bridge well built does not have to push back against the wind or necessarily just ride the wave of it, is built to withstand both. And that comes, like, even just that bridge is such a beautiful illustration, because the ways in which people build bridges is so integral to even structure that we can learn of our body. The ways in which we walk, the ways in which our feet touch the ground, is very much, and the shoes that we wear is very much like and akin to the structures in bridges. In which case, the base box behind your toes and your heel are very much grounding points, and when tethered appropriately, when structured well, create the perfect element of tension, and of relief, and of arch, and able to hold pressure. I think our shoes are very much designed to constrict that, and ever since I switched to tabby shoes, my bone structure has been so much better. My back's been so much better. Not to necessarily just tag tabby shoes in there, but, in a literal way, your structure. And perhaps that is, something to also consider in meditation, the ways in which we walk, the ways in which we feel pressure on our big toe as well as our pinky toe, the ways in which we feel pressure on our heel, the ways in which that bends. So as to slow your mind down and slow time down and recuperate if you are exhausted, but also continue to build and nurture, if you've been, and if you haven't been, join us. One of us. So all of that being said, we'll pull some cards and we will see what collectively screams of us, eh? Okay, interesting. Ooh. A lot going on in there. Alright, my friend. Much like we are hanging out, and there are cards in between us. Make your body available to the biggest breath, and your awareness available to any sensations in your body. You don't have to tap into anything, but you dare. Meanwhile, I will try and tap into all of this. Take a deep breath in. And exhale. Take a deep breath in. And exhale. Take a deep breath in. And exhale. Interesting, interesting. Okay. In a very literal way, it was like this funny angle of sight, and then we're not accounting for the angles, or not accounting for the curvature. In which case, there's maybe a blind spot, in which case, there's perhaps a glare in the sight, in which case, it is perhaps the element of surprise, but also like deja vu. That explains it. Okay. I did also feel this very much from my chest, but in a very contained way, and very much so grounded in the shoulders. Unclear as to whether or not it was like grasping or a hug, because it was subtle. But Nine of Hearts inverted, and this beautiful yellow, which is continuously speaking at this time to, very much solar plexus chakra, very much the ways in which we communicate, the ways in which we present ourselves, the ways in which we project reality through our essence. But in order to do that, first you must identify all of the energy in your body and its coherence. And so, hence the inversion. However, I think if people are very skeptical of themselves, that's a good sign. Sometimes I think people still will fall a little short, and that's okay. We're not really set in a system designed for our integrity, so we are swimming upstream, and kudos for trying. But I think it being so high calling, but also very much internalized, very much suggests us as a collective realizing our own power, our own sovereignty, our own capacity to think and form beliefs. And that's a big part of it, forming beliefs, because again, trigness requires multiple aspects to a structure, and that's not necessarily any one thing that is, multiple pieces of evidence to coincide a thought, or to help support a belief, or, multiple modes of practice so that we feel like our, spiritual needs are met. Which is, in a very literal way, like, cool, you love boxing, you love kickboxing, you love Tai Chi, dope. You love weightlifting, dope. Integrate meditation. Integrate Tai Chi or yin yoga. Yoga Nidra even. Integrate good sleep, which is why they say sleep is so important in muscle building and recovery. And so that's very much, sort of an invisible three in the ways in which we identify a truth to a thing. The chirality of any molecule, which perhaps is relieving some tension in body and practice, very much awareness of the ways in which we find posture versus hold posture. And I mean that very metaphorically too, because sometimes we're posturing for the world in a certain way, or masking, which is a form of, posturing for defense too. That also takes its toll on the body, whether or not we're conscious of it. And again, there are ways to become very aware and awake in parts of your body that are sleeping, or that you don't think are sleeping well, or perhaps aren't sleeping well, in which case, yes, also the same. You start with an outer layer, one step at a time, which is very much this Jupiter, or not Jupiter, Saturn, Neptune too. It's like little things, but big picture. Subtleties, but big spirits. Big things, little pictures, for sure. And the stories that we weave, which is a beautiful thing, or it can be a very destructive thing if you are not aware of the story you are weaving, or not sure where it comes from. Or not sure where it comes from. I saw something recently that was like, in the Bible it says, I think it was reading a comment section of something strange, but in the Bible it says not to trust your own thoughts because they don't come from you. And like, what a fear-mongering thing, when in reality, like, we're coming to learn that there's a form and a structure to your thoughts and a wave to the particle, which isn't altogether, I think, new. I think it's perhaps a new understanding applied to the matter, but I don't think is a new understanding altogether. So allow yourself to think outside the box and understand the waveform that everything takes, including your thoughts. And that is not to say to fear them for what forms they will take, or where they come from. That is to say, be conscious of what you're projecting and what you're ingesting for yourself. And again, no fear. Collective consciousness isn't a bad thing if we don't abuse it, and if we're conscious of what we're putting into it. Jack of clubs, 2 of diamonds, 6 of clubs. Exactly that, really. Like, what are we building with it? With this fire, with this breath, with this sense of self. And I think, in a very real way, perhaps we'll go all through another wave of, Western society trying to understand Kundalini rising. But ultimately, I think having to understand that it's not just the snake head goes up, it's understanding where the tail's at. It's understanding how to charm it from the heart. It's understanding where it's rooted in, and the frequency that you send out to the ground, to the snake, really, to the horse, because riding on its back, you can feel it. And so, it is not just, working upwards. It is very much expansion in the root. It is working downwards. A tree can only grow as tall and as wide as a healthy and expansive root system, and many times, the root system is much bigger than the tree even looks. Even with houseplants, sometimes those real beefy, juicy one-thingers are a real chunky root system, or like beet-like root system. And so we're really fleshing out what that beet root system is in us, so that we can figure out how we want to flower, or finally let that flowering come through. Because that Jack of Wands is very much like, there is a fractal identity to it. It's a beautiful thing. But if we aren't aware of what's feeding it, it can be like poison in the well. And because it is always a growing thing, much like any other living thing, we do have to nurture it before it gets to do whatever it wants, and perhaps doesn't do much. Like a Tamagotchi, like an inner Tamagotchi. Perhaps that's a little particular for somebody. Which, 2 of diamonds, perhaps it is a little particular for somebody, and it's just the right kind of particular. So be open to that kind of strange particular that exists and occurs within you, and that exists and occurs in the world. That is not to say accepting of that which goes entirely against your truth, or that tries to change your truth. That is not to say to accept things that try to force your truth to change. Because again, if we have a solid beetroot structure, or like a solid geometry, then, we don't have to clash those things. Somebody trying to take it over is like creating their own galaxy and creating its own gravitational pull. We don't need to do that. We don't need to do that. Much like a good DJ can spin 2 records at the same time and give you a good rhythm. That's what we're looking for. We're looking for the collaboration of frequencies, which is, also touch, but please also understand that in a very real way, subatomically, we're never really fully touching anything. But all the more reason why, understanding thought projection and understanding the waveforms that your, inner monologuing takes is important, because particles can feel that, other people can feel that. And it is why so many people feel exhausted, I think. Why so many people feel overwhelmed in one way, shape, or form. So how do we ground? How do we recharge? How do we find ritual, find solace, find safety in ourselves? What are we building? Is it a fortress? Or is it foundational? Is it a fortress, or is it a temple? Is it a temptation or a temple? Which is interesting. Which is very interesting. Sorry, not to sing song. I think in the past, we've had one idea of how we take up space, and what that space is, and what that space means. And realistically, I don't think we've had much of a clue about just how solid or real that space is, let alone to be tested with reality. However, in knowing that you are space, and that you are particles, and that you can place them, may that alone let you walk into a room understanding what that frequency means, and presenting itself as something to be proud of, to treasure, to be very grateful for, and to see as providing and regenerative in and of itself. Which is a really interesting mix of words. I need a better word for pride. Your presence. Because I don't think that can be misunderstood as so domineering, or so needing to implant. Does that make sense? Does that make sense? Alright, let's see what space has to say about time and that bit of information. I'm not going to question it, I'm just going to let it come through. Alright, much like we're hanging out, take 3 deep breaths with me, making your body open to its fullest breath and aware of any sensations that arise. Take a deep breath in, and exhale. breath in. And exhale. Take a deep breath in. And exhale. Interesting, cool, calmer, like it. Oh, I love that. It felt very resigned in nature, but in a very relaxing way. Not to be confused with giving up. I think it's more like enjoying the ride, more like enjoying the scenery and the ride, and just kind of being along for a good time, like being along for, you know, whatever lessons there is. I went geocaching with a friend once, and we didn't find the treasure. But at the end, we were like, the real treasure was friendship, and we both laughed, and it was also very true, and it was a really sweet day in general. And so the lovers is our top of the deck here, and the world is at the bottom of the deck here. And so I think in a very big way, how do we announce our love for the world? How do we understand what projecting that means? And, you know, I myself am very critical and curious in general, so that is something that I endeavor to always operate in. Is like, yes, be curious and be, you know, use critical thinking skills, but that does not have to mean, you know, consistently callous. That does not mean that it has to negatively impact my capacity for belief, and all the more so that I can consider the best possibility, the absolute best possibility. And you know what? I am always thankful that I can consider the worst, because I am also that much more ready for the absolute best. It's kind of like, if you can't handle me at my worst, you don't deserve me at my best. And perhaps that's something that needs to be said to yourself, internalized. Like, if you can't love yourself at your worst, like now, perhaps thinking that, you know, you've got to change all these things, and this is what you're gonna do, and da-da-da-da-da. If you're not, you know, if you're wish-making, but you're not operating from a place of self-love and gratitude, then it is from a very critical place. It's almost like wishing you ill, rather than supporting the momentum. So we must support the momentum. That is in the present moment, that is in willingness to look in the corners of our minds and the corners of our eyes. It is peripheral vision. In a very real way, it's your willingness to see the other side. And that's not to say, again, like accepting it. We've got some fucked up other sides out there. But I do aspire for a world where even our oppressors have healed so much that there's no longer trauma to heal or to integrate, that we can all move from a positive place. And it is, in a very macroscopic way, breaking generational cycles. But that is possible because there's absolutely proof of generations working toward that. I think in a very real way there's a lot of hopelessness in the world, but there is a lot of very alive spirit speaking to those willing to listen and those with an open heart. And in a very real way, it helps us to fan the flames, or to put out fires, so that we can be more aglow rather than temperamental. Does that make sense? And don't get me wrong, I used to for sure have anger problems. But there's multiple angles that we can come at that from. And in my own journey, like on a literal element, it wasn't just releasing the anger, it was learning how to identify it, and heal it or integrate it, or rid myself of it entirely. Um, and like exercise it, really. And that's not just physical, that is figuring out what it needs, what it wants, where it wants to go. Like blessing a haunted house, or like exercising in other ways. In order to see beautiful things ahead with the lovers and the world, ultimately. In order to see beauty, love, community, celebration, compassion, and not just see, but particularly with this lover's angel, feel. Even these characters have their like hair entwined, and there is more than two, which I'm pretty sure I have a video on already. Actually, if you check it out, I think actually, you know what? That's the geometry of relationships video. Now that I think about it, and we talk about again those three things, and it's not like, oh, this must be an orgy. It is versions of ourselves that we nurture, and that's past and present. Versions of ourselves that we honor, and that's very much the facilitation of, or the, holding of space, the ability to hold even the darkness to the light, and look at it fearlessly. To be able to walk into dark corners unafraid, to be able to enter the circle unafraid. And that's more so than just proving yourself. Because the angel can't see. The angel needs to feel it. The angel can smell your essence. And for sure, if you are sensory sensitive, there's some funny smells out there. There was another reading that came up recently. I think it was, I don't know, it's probably the last one. About the smell of sulfur with demons. And I've smelled sulfur in the air with geysers. It's interesting. The water holds many stories. So what I think we understand is demons is simply what we apply fear to. It is a misnomer, it is an inversion of information as a simulation. So, need not fear. Should you trust yourself enough? Both ends of the candlestick and pleasure. Interesting. Perhaps that has more to do with the ways in which we define pleasure and our willingness to receive, regenerate, be penetrated by, in a very real way. That's also the ways in which we're willing to give back an experience, in order to receive at all. And I love that because what that comes up in meditation as for me, and what I think is seriously alluded to here, especially in like feeble confidence, because we can have, collect, but if the quality is not there, the quantity does not matter. If the spirit is lost, then the body feels empty. If the mind's become an enemy, then it feels like nothing is safe. And so, with that, don't just go outside, don't just touch grass, but yes, do that. Find a tree, find any patch of grass, find a patch of sunlight, find a patch of grass that's caught in the middle between shade and sunlight. Sit on a wood floor, sit on your favorite chair, whatever it is, however it is, although preferably something living, and I do think you can practice this indoors and with house plants, but like to feel it outside, to just feel it outside is so important. So please consider it. But there's something called a mula bandha, And I think very much so that we have to be willing to be receptive to the earth. We have to be willing to sort of consummate with it, rather than just purging, rather than just expelling, in so many ways, rather than just like in with the good, out with the bad. That when we breathe, we're able to take in and breathe with something living and take in its energy, or something that you love. Honestly, for sure you can do this with inanimate objects, but that's a whole other story, to some degree. But with trees, like I'm sure you can begin to imagine the root systems and the ways in which it probably passes under you, or touches you, or breathes with you. But you feel like your breath is not just opening your body, but allowing your body to open to the energy around it. I don't recommend doing this in a crowded room. With the mula bandha, essentially like a sphincter in your throat, when you sing or when you talk, you open and close your butthole. You open and close your butthole, and open and you're inhaling so that you're receptive to, and then exhaling, closing, or clenching, I suppose. Not so as that you close off to energy, but so that you pull what energy you've brought in deeper into the body, so that you create sort of like a vacuum and then integrate. Much in the same ways that a breath hold would do with the body and blood oxygenation levels. But, so with that being said, however it is you visualize it, ultimately it's like whatever inguinal iliacus muscles that you pull to stop your urine stream, or to flex that base underneath your spine. In which case, on an inhale, you open your body to receive from living, from life, from experience, from the tree in your backyard, from the birds singing, from the information and electric charge on the rays, on the leaves. And when you close that muscle on the exhale and clench, you pull that energy into the body as you exhale. So the air may come out, and you see it and you feel it moving horizontal outside of you, but you feel it moving upwards and around you. Does that make sense? That is something that I also do entering any apartment. Anytime I've moved, that's one of the ways in which I introduce myself to the space. And so before anything's, where it needs to be, for sure there's cleansing, there's other things that take place, but I'll sit in the middle of wherever it is and acquaint myself with the directions, and acquaint myself with the essential foundations of the room, and expand my awareness of sound, my awareness of sight, and then expand that internally. So what is grounding in this new place, in this setting? And so I activate my mula bandha, and I breathe with it, and I take in whatever information the place has for me, and I introduce myself to the place, and I look for I look for the foundation in it, and I guess kind of like pass through the history of it. And in a very literal way, like in my mind, it's like going through the layers of the floorboards, like going to the corners of the room, building the room around me, going to the other rooms, and then going through the floorboards and going, maybe through my neighbor's walls, and then into an idea of what these layers are before I hit the ground, and then into the ground, and perhaps deeper, to see what I see. So, try that wherever you are, and allow the space around you to acquaint itself with you, and to also participate in the moment, so that you can feel regenerated and also regenerate. Too often do I think you know, we kind of also live in this fricative space between like being able to project and like go out, and also uh, like withholding in a very large way. Um, Perhaps a lot of us are more often than not looking for settings in which, yes, we have a lot to add to the setting, but we also leave feeling really regenerated. And I have joked actually that I wonder if like that's what good therapy feels like. um, or how you know that it's not really. Um, Damn. Okay, I feel like that's a really good place to call it. Um, because it's a real good way to know if it's not. Truth. Truth. All right. I love you very much. Thank you for your presence and your awareness. May we only be able to go deeper into the cells so that we can see deeper outside of ourselves. Expand your depth perception. Wata squish sa tanata. Thank you, thank you. From the bottom of my heart, love. I will see you next time. Tanata kai.